Thank you for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. We're now more than a week into the Israel-Hamas war, one that was started by one of the more brutal and frankly disturbing terrorist attacks that we've seen in modern times, leading to the deaths of over 1,400 Israelis. In the meantime, retaliatory airstrikes from Israel have led to at least 2,700 Palestinian fatalities in the Gaza Strip, and now a growing humanitarian crisis is developing as well, as Israel has ordered an evacuation of more than 1 million people from the densely populated northern half of Gaza to the southern part of it. That is presumed to be ahead of a likely Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip in the coming days and weeks. And while there are many, many lenses to look through this complicated, heartbreaking conflict, we do want to look at this through a legal lens. And for a bit more about this is CU Denver Associate Professor Betcy who joins us. And Betcy, you specialize in international law, and there are, again, many questions in terms of international law around this, I think, on both sides of the equation. But first and foremost, I think the more pressing issue at this point, as we record this on Monday, October the 16th, is the developing humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. What does international law have to say about the obligations for both Israel and the Palestinians surrounding that?
Great question, Chris. Thank you for that. And let me also thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Before I answer your question, if I may, I'd like to just say at the outset, my heart goes out to all those who have suffered enormously as a result of the terrible, terrible attacks on October 7th. And I think about all those who have suffered in the long cycle of violence that led up to the tragic, awful events on October 7th, and those who will as a result of those events. And the suffering and the tragedy is not limited to those in the Middle East. I'm sure you've heard of the unspeakable murder of the 6-year-old Palestinian boy yesterday. And so Jews and Muslims here in the U.S. are also feeling the effects of this terrible situation. So it's just heart-rending, and these are difficult times we live in. To answer your excellent question, international law does have things to say about the obligations placed on the actors most importantly involved in the current crisis, particularly with regards to obligations to civilians fleeing the conflict in Gaza. The body of international law that kind of regulates the conduct of warfare is called international humanitarian law. And one of its most important principles, I would say most important principle, is this idea that warring factions have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and they have to refrain from intentionally targeting civilians. And so what that means for, say, the Israelis is that they cannot intentionally target Palestinian civilians who are trying to flee Gaza. There was this evacuation order that Israel issued. And so Gazans are trying to flee in compliance with that evacuation order. They cannot be targeted as they are trying to leave Gaza. Now, there are many commentators who have said that evacuation order is not really reasonable. As you mentioned, 1 million plus Gazans have been asked to leave. It is difficult under such short notice for that many people to leave. So Israel has to give reasonable opportunity for civilians to leave a conflict. It also means that not everybody can leave. There are those who are physically unable to leave, and those who are caring for those who are physically unable to leave. And these are civilians. So Israel cannot assume that all those who are present in Gaza, once it starts its military operations, it cannot assume that they are no longer civilians, that they are somehow fighters. They still retain their civilian status under international humanitarian law, even if they remain in Gaza after an evacuation order. So this primary principle under this body of law that requires warring factions to distinguish between civilians and combatants holds on Israel even after an evacuation order has been issued. So Israel is still obligated to distinguish between civilians and combatants among those who remain in Gaza once the invasion or whatever military operation is underway, and to refrain from intentionally targeting those civilians.
Thank you for that, Betsy. It seems to me like there's a lot of potential gray area within some of those stipulations you put out there. So, for example, there are, I think, many documented cases over the years that from the United Nations that Hamas uses human shields, essentially civilians, to smuggle the way on through. So, hypothetically, here, there are people fleeing, or there are Hamas militants, Hamas terrorists within a building, but there happen to be civilians within there. What does international law say about that instance specifically? And I ask that not just as a hypothetical, because that's probably what you would hear from the Israeli government. Is that not correct?
Yeah. So international humanitarian law is also clear that civilians can't be used as human shields. So using civilians in that way is a violation of international humanitarian law. That being said, it doesn't remove the obligation on Israel to not intentionally target civilians. Even if they're being used as human shields, Israel still has obligations to protect those civilians. It is not to say that any of these requirements are easy. They are all hard. But just because they're difficult doesn't provide an excuse for not honoring those requirements.
Good to know, obviously, in that case. I suppose before I kind of want to look a little bit at the lens of the Hamas side of things here as well. What are the consequences, and how are those enforced? So, for example, let's say there are cases of human rights violations here. What are those consequences, and how are they enforced?
That's a great question. So there is an international court that can handle war crimes. It is called the International Criminal Court. And it has actually opened up an investigation into the situation in Palestine back in 2021. And the current chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has said that the current situation falls within that ongoing investigation. So, and it can investigate all parties, not just one side. So that includes Hamas and Israel and any other parties that might be committing violations of international humanitarian law. So the International Criminal Court does exist, and it is it has opened an investigation into the situation in Palestine. And the international community has an obligation to assist the court in investigating potential war crimes. And if it finds evidence of war crimes, to help it prosecute those war crimes. And that includes providing adequate funding so that those investigations and prosecutions can occur. It also has an obligation to hand over individuals for whom the International Criminal Court might issue arrest warrants.
And that sounds like obviously a lengthy process, as you mentioned, that started back in 2021. And obviously, I would imagine that'll only get extended with what looks to be, at least has the potential. Hopefully, it's not a long conflict, but obviously, all signs are that it will be. That said, I do want to turn our attention, because there's so many unique, in the worst senses, things about this specific instance. And for example, Hamas runs the Gaza Strip. That said, they committed one of the most horrible crimes. I mean, to call that a war crime, I think, would be an understatement of the century. What can be done to punish them? And at the same time, is that perhaps extra difficult because they are the representative of the people of the Gaza Strip? How does that all work?
It's such a difficult question. I mean, you're right. There are what Hamas, what those attacks did was produce probably the bloodiest day for the Jewish community since the Holocaust. I mean, that is just how significant that attack was. I want to push back a little bit about this notion of whether Hamas represents the Palestinians in Gaza. There were elections in 2006, I believe, in which that were monitored by international observers, in which Hamas won those elections. But that was the last time elections were held in Gaza, and half of the population of Gaza are children. So they didn't participate in those elections in 2006. So it is questionable how much Hamas represents the people of Gaza. It is questionable how much popular support they have. Um, so, but one thing is clear. Not all Palestinians support Hamas and certainly don't support what Hamas did on October 7th. So we have to be crystal clear that any attempts to punish Hamas, and that includes through military strikes, must take care not to assume that all Palestinians are supporters of Hamas, were involved in this horrific event on October 7th. That again, I go back to international law, that international law requires all those who are involved in responding to the situation on October 7th to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and not to assume that all Palestinians are combatants.
Absolutely. I suppose, I guess, what is the design? So maybe when with these parameters installed here, if human shields are being used, what would international law, what would the United Nations essentially want Israel to do in this specific instance? How do they get justice, so to speak, for what happened on October the 7th?
Well, I mean, I think for the United Nations, their primary concern, as articulated by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is the plight of civilians. And this is not limited to Palestinian civilians. It's also the case that the UN is concerned about Israeli civilians as well. But the humanitarian crisis, as you pointed out in your introduction, is extremely dire in Gaza right now. And they are some of the most vulnerable, marginalized people in the region, if not the world. They have suffered for a long time, and they will continue to suffer again. And I should note, we've talked about sort of the unprecedented nature of the attack on October 7th. And so the desire to respond strongly and harshly by Israel is certainly understandable. But there is a reason why international humanitarian law has these restrictions and limitations, constraints placed on belligerents. And those reasons are not only moral, but they're also strategic. It is not effective to go after civilians. It is not effective to attack your opponent indiscriminately, because it will come back to haunt you. The attack that Hamas launched is a perfect example. The brutality of that attack has resulted in this very strong Israeli response. So the constraints that international humanitarian law places on belligerents is there not only for the sake of humanity, but also for the interests of the countries and actors involved. It does not serve their long-term interests to be as brutal as possible.
Totally makes sense. I guess the question I would kind of want to, I know this may be kind of on the fringes of international law in this instance, but I would imagine that there's a framework in place that would try and funnel that desire of an Israeli response into something resembling justice, because I think it's safe to say that any reasonable government would not tolerate what happened on October the 7th. So what is the design for Israel to do in response if this is, in this case?
Well, certainly international law does allow Israel to engage in self-defense. It's not to say that Israel has no ability to respond to this terrible attack on its civilians. So Israel does have, under international law, the ability to engage in self-defense actions, but those self-defense actions are not limitless. And as I've mentioned, the International Criminal Court is also investigating, has opened an investigation into the situation in Palestine. And that is an investigation, as I mentioned earlier, that is open to all actors that might have committed violations of international law. So there are mechanisms in place for Israel to seek justice under the dictates of international law. It is up to Israel to act within those constraints. And again, I say this. I mentioned that those are not also for the advancement of morality, but politically speaking, it will serve Israel well. We can think back. There have been a lot of comparisons made between the events on October 7th and the 9/11 attacks here in the U.S. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was widespread support and sympathy and compassion directed at the United States because of the brutality and the scale of those attacks. In many ways, the world was with the US. Some would argue that some of the subsequent actions by the US might have squandered some of that solidarity and support. We're thinking about, say, the war in Iraq, which many found to be illegal. And so some of that widespread support was diminished by the actions that the US took in response to 9/11. I would caution Israel to take seriously those lessons. Right now, there are large segments of the international community that support Israel, sometimes to the detriment of civilians on the ground, both Israeli and Palestinian. But right now, Israel has an opportunity to take very seriously how it wants to react to something terrible that's happened, because the actions that it puts in place now will have long-term consequences for Israel. In the same way that the actions that the US took in the aftermath of 9/11 are actions that we are still feeling the consequences of today in the United States.
Well, I suppose there's been a lot of focus. We've discussed, obviously, the Hamas, Israel, the Palestinian people, how they fall under the umbrella of Hamas. Maybe by, as you mentioned, half the people in the Gaza Strip are children. That's obviously a complicated part of the thing. Another complicated part of all this is that the country of Egypt shares about a 12-mile or 12-kilometer border on the southern end of it, the Rafah crossing in particular, with the Gaza Strip. Egypt has essentially acted as a neutral here so far. Does international law say anything about what Egypt should do in this particular situation?
Yeah, that's also another really terrific question. There is an international treaty that stipulates obligations that countries have towards refugees. And Egypt is a signatory to that treaty and its additional protocol. So it does have some obligations under international law towards Palestinians who might be fleeing to Egypt to seek refuge. And some of those obligations include providing entry to Palestinians that have credible claims that provide them this refugee status, to treat those Palestinians that Egypt provides entry to no differently than Egyptian citizens, and to not send back refugees to Gaza if the situation is too unsafe for them to return. There are exceptions to those legal requirements, one of which is that Egypt is not obligated to provide entry to active fighters. So for those who are actively fighting in Hamas against Israel, Egypt does not have to provide them refugee status in Egypt. But unfortunately, what that opens the door to is potential gender discrimination, because oftentimes in conflict situations, men, particularly draft age men, are assumed to be fighters. Now, we've already discussed not everybody in Gaza is a member of Hamas, especially not all the men. And so Egypt may say, because of our security concerns, we will only allow women and children into Egypt as refugees and not allow any men who may be civilians. Now, that assumption that prevents Egypt from allowing male civilians into Egypt as refugees may also be the same assumption that Israel will operate on, so that it may target male civilians that it sees in Gaza, assuming that they are fighters on behalf of Hamas. So there is a real danger that male civilians who have credible fears may not be able to gain sanctuary in Egypt because of this assumption of malehood and belligerency. So those are some of the international legal obligations that Egypt has towards potential refugees. But then there's a separate question of capacity. You and I have talked about recently the fighting that erupted in Sudan and the refugee flows that have been produced by that fighting. Egypt is housing a significant number of Sudanese refugees from that conflict. And so it is in a diminished position to absorb additional refugees from the conflict ongoing in Gaza. So there are issues of what the law requires and what countries are actually capable of providing. And then lastly, there are likely a significant number of Palestinians who will choose not to leave because they are concerned that if they leave, they may not be able to return to their homes. If they flee to Egypt, they may become, in a sense, double refugees. They're refugees in Gaza, and then they may become longtime refugees in Egypt because they'll be unable to return to their homes. And they don't want that. So they may not leave. So despite all the protections that international law affords refugees, it doesn't provide a comprehensive solution to the plight of civilians in Gaza.
A lot of complicated questions here, and it seems like lots of international law violations that have happened and may occur, unfortunately. With that said, this is a transparent thought, is that international law may feel increasingly, maybe meaningless is a harsh word, but diminished with blatant violations. I think we've seen it in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In Africa, I think you mentioned the Sudanese conflict, as well as several of the other conflicts that have taken place in the Sahel in particular. Am I wrong in feeling that international law feels increasingly more like a slap on the wrist than anything else?
Yeah, I completely understand that sentiment. And I feel that even as a person who firmly believes in the value of international law and does a lot of research on international law, so I can understand the kind of frustration and the questioning of the value of international law right now, given all the tragedies that we have seen in recent days and years. But as I think about that, I'm reminded, I'm currently teaching a course on the United Nations. And I'm reminded of something that I came across in my textbook. And it's a quote by a former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson. And what she said was, and I'm going to paraphrase, she said, "Today's human rights violations are tomorrow's conflicts." And to me, that kind of captures the importance of international law. And that is, if we tolerate violations of international law today, because maybe we're uninterested, or we don't find them important, or we don't want to invest the political capital or resource to dealing with them today, we are opening the door to much more complicated and expensive and time-intensive and tragic conflicts tomorrow. So to me, that quote highlights the importance of the international community's attempts to preserve international law and to punish those who violate it. Because otherwise, we are setting ourselves up for situations that are going to require much more blood and treasure, and that are going to involve much more heartache.
Uh, Absolutely, and certainly understand that component of everything. Um, Betsy, any final ads or anything that we haven't covered? I mean, I know there's a million things we could go down, but any important aspects of this that we have not covered yet?
I would just urge your listeners to not feel helpless. It feels like a helpless situation, and that as ordinary folks don't have a ton of power. But I would say that's not true. The US is still a really important actor in the region and in this conflict in particular. And the US has been in recent days arguably responsive to the concerns Americans have about the plight of civilians on the ground, both Palestinian and civilians, and has put pressure on Israel to act with restraint as it thinks about how it wants to respond to the tragedy that it experienced on October 7th. So I would just encourage your audience to think about um, how they can reach out to their elected officials and voice their concerns about what's happening on the ground, and appreciate that as American citizens, they are some of the most powerful people on the planet, and they can use that power to do something um, equally powerful on the ground in the Middle East.
So, all right. Well, thank you, CU Denver Associate Professor Betsy Joes, for your insight on the complicated spider web here of international law and how it pertains to the ongoing conflict, and one that's unfortunately likely to continue for the foreseeable future. We appreciate a few minutes of your time. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having this difficult and important conversation.